Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, March 17th, 1945. 6:47 in the morning. The train platform smelled of diesel fuel and spring rain. 37 German boys stepped onto American soil with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. They ranged in age from 14 to 17. Children, really. Children in uniforms that hung loose on frames hollowed out by months of starvation. Erich Hoffmann was 15 years old. He came from Dresden, what was left of Dresden anyway. The city had burned 5 weeks earlier, consumed by firestorms that turned stone to ash and people to shadows on walls. His mother had survived, barely. His father had died at Stalingrad 3 years before. His older brother had disappeared with a U-boat somewhere in the Atlantic in 1943. Now Erich stood on an Oklahoma train platform, the last Hoffmann male still breathing, waiting for what came next. He'd been told what to expect. The propaganda officers had been explicit. Americans were savages who tortured prisoners. They showed particular cruelty to young ones, making examples of children to demoralize German forces back home. The officers had shown photographs, grainy images that supposedly proved American brutality. They'd shared testimonies from soldiers who'd allegedly survived American captivity, though nobody ever met these survivors personally. The message had been clear and consistent. Surrender meant death. Young prisoners should expect no mercy. Erich believed them. Why wouldn't he? He was 15. He'd been in uniform for 4 months, conscripted into the Volkssturm in December, when Germany scraped the bottom of its manpower barrel and found boys barely old enough to shave. He'd fired his rifle twice in combat, both times without hitting anything, both times too terrified to aim properly, before American soldiers overran his position during the Rhine crossing on March 3rd. Now he stood with 36 other boys on a platform, in a country so far from home it might as well be another planet, waiting for the cruelty to begin. The American guards watched them with expressions Erich couldn't read. Professional, bored even. Not the sadistic monsters propaganda had promised, but maybe that was part of the psychological torture. Maybe they waited until you relaxed before the real horror started. A sergeant stepped forward, tall, maybe 27 or 28 years old, thin as a fence post, face weathered by sun and wind. He wore the casual confidence of someone who knew his side was winning. His uniform was clean, his boots were polished. Everything about him spoke of abundance, of systems that still functioned, of a country that hadn't been bombed into rubble and desperation. Erich's hands trembled. He gripped his threadbare rucksack tighter, trying to stop the shaking. It didn't work. Fear had its own rhythm, its own logic. You couldn't reason with it or control it. You just endured it and hoped you didn't shame yourself completely. The sergeant reached into his pocket. Every boy on that platform tensed. This was it. The moment. Whatever came out of that pocket would tell them everything about what happened next. A weapon. Orders. A demonstration of American power and German helplessness. The sergeant's hand emerged holding a chocolate bar. A Hershey bar. Real chocolate, wrapped in brown paper that crinkled when he held it. The letters were in English, incomprehensible to Erich, but the shape was unmistakable. Chocolate. Actual chocolate. The sergeant walked directly to Erich and held it out. Erich stared. His brain couldn't process what his eyes were seeing. American guards distributed chocolate. That was insanity. That was propaganda in reverse. That was either kindness, so unexpected it felt dangerous, or a trap so sophisticated he couldn't detect the mechanism. He looked at the sergeant's face. The man was smiling. Not cruelly, not mockingly, just smiling, like someone offering a gift to a child, which, Erich supposed, with a distant part of his mind that still functioned, was exactly what this was. "Take it, son," the sergeant said in English. Erich didn't understand the words, but the gesture was clear. The chocolate was being offered. Actually offered. No strings visible, no immediate punishment apparent. Stefan Braun stood next to Erich, 16 years old, tall and skeletal, from Hamburg. He'd watched his city burn from Allied bombing. He'd seen things no child should see. Now he leaned close and whispered in German, his voice carrying dark humor, born of exhaustion and disbelief. Either it's safe, or it's poisoned, and we die. But at least we die having tasted chocolate. Eric's hands moved almost without his conscious command. He took the chocolate bar. The wrapper crinkled in his trembling fingers. The weight was real, solid, approximately 2 ounces of something that hadn't existed in his life for 3 years. He tore the wrapper. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the morning quiet. Brown chocolate, segmented into squares, appeared. The smell hit him first. Sweet, rich. A memory from before the war, from childhood so distant it felt like someone else's life. Eric took a bite. The sweetness exploded across his tongue like a revelation. Pure and impossibly good. After years of ersatz everything, of substitutes and scarcity, of food that tasted like survival rather than pleasure, this chocolate tasted like hope, like the world might contain good things again, like maybe not everything had been destroyed. He chewed slowly, swallowed, waited for poison symptoms that never came, waited for the trap to spring, waited for the cruelty propaganda had promised. Nothing happened. There was just chocolate. Real chocolate, given freely by an enemy guard, who was still smiling at him with something that looked almost like kindness. The cognitive dissonance was so profound that Eric felt dizzy, though that might have been low blood sugar rather than philosophical confusion. He hadn't eaten properly in months. His body was consuming itself to stay alive. The chocolate hit his bloodstream like medicine. Tears started falling. He couldn't stop them, didn't try. Just stood there on an Oklahoma train platform, crying while eating chocolate an American soldier had given him, for no apparent reason except basic human decency. Behind him, other boys were receiving similar gifts. Chocolate bars distributed to 37 enemy children by American guards who should have hated them, who had every reason to hate them, whose country they'd been trying to destroy just weeks earlier. The propaganda had been wrong, comprehensively, systematically wrong. And if they'd lied about American cruelty, what else had been lies? What else had they believed that was poison dressed as truth? Eric finished the chocolate bar, carefully folded the wrapper, put it in his pocket. Already he knew he would keep this, not sure why yet, just certain that this moment, this piece of brown paper, represented something important. A before and after, a line crossed, a world shattered and beginning to reform into shapes he didn't recognize. The processing took 3 hours. Medical examinations, delousing showers, uniform exchange, paperwork documenting names and capture details. The American staff conducted everything with efficient professionalism, treating the boys firmly but without cruelty, maintaining authority without inflicting degradation. The showers were private. The medical examinations were respectful. The new clothes, American prison uniforms marked with POW stencils, were clean and properly sized. Someone had anticipated that children needed different dimensions than adult prisoners. Felix Weber couldn't believe the showers. He was 14 years old, the smallest of the group. His uniform had hung loose despite 2 alterations. Now he stood under a stream of hot water, actual hot water, abundant and clean, lasting more than 30 seconds. In Germany, hot water had disappeared years ago. Bathing had been reduced to cold sponging when water was available at all. He stayed under the stream until an American private tapped on the stall and said something in English that probably meant, "Time's up, son." Felix dried with a towel that was rough but clean, feeling transformed by simple hygiene. Like washing away dirt, had also removed some of the fear and deprivation and trauma that had accumulated over years of war. The medical examination revealed what anyone looking could see: severe malnutrition. The camp physician, Dr. Elizabeth Whitmore, documented heights and weights that painted a picture of systematic starvation. Eric Hoffman, 5 feet 7 inches, 98 pounds. Stefan Braun, 5 feet 10 inches, 105 pounds. Felix Weber, 5 feet 3 inches, 84 pounds. All showed signs of vitamin deficiencies, untreated injuries, chronic exhaustion. Dr. Whitmore made notes that would later become part of military reports about conditions in Germany's final months, about a regime so desperate it had conscripted starving children and sent them to war without proper food or training or any chance of survival. The meal that followed was served in a dining area separate from adult prisoners, another accommodation for age. The boys sat at long tables, uncertain and silent, as American cooks brought food that exceeded anything propaganda had led them to expect. Beef stew, bread with butter, green beans, milk, actual milk, white and cold, and tasting like childhood memories from before rationing had turned everything into substitutes and scarcity. Eric ate slowly. His stomach protested the rich food after months of deprivation. His mind struggled to process the contradiction between propaganda promises and present reality. He'd been told Americans starved prisoners. Yet here was abundance. He'd been told Americans tortured children. Yet here was mercy. He'd been told Americans were weak and cruel. Yet here was strength expressed through restraint and cruelty notably absent despite every justification for it. Stefan ate mechanically. His tall frame needed calories even as his mind refused to accept their source. He kept thinking about propaganda sessions where officers had shown photographs of American prisoner camps. Starvation and torture presented as documented fact. But those photographs had been grainy, unclear, possibly fabricated. This meal was concrete, undeniable, real. If propaganda had lied about this, what else had been lies? The question opened chasms Stefan wasn't ready to explore. Felix couldn't finish his portion. His shrunken stomach simply couldn't accommodate food his body desperately needed. He sat, staring at half-eaten stew, feeling tears prick his eyes. Wasting food felt like sin. Abundance felt like punishment after years of scarcity. Kindness from enemies hurt worse than cruelty would have. An American cook noticed. Sergeant Theodore Calloway. Broad-shouldered from Georgia, grandmother's accent still thick in his voice, even when speaking English. He came over, said something gentle that Felix couldn't understand, and wrapped the remaining food for Felix to have later. The gesture was small, but overwhelming. Recognition that prisoners were human, that children needed care, that even enemies deserved basic compassion. The living quarters were simple but clean. Wooden barracks with bunks, thin mattresses, lockers for personal items they didn't have. The windows had bars, but also screens against insects, suggesting concern for prisoner comfort beyond minimum security requirements. The floors were swept. The walls were painted. Someone had hung a bulletin board with camp rules translated into German, acknowledging that prisoners needed to understand expectations rather than just be punished for violations. Captain Nathaniel Harding stood at the front of the assembled boys. He was 34 years old, from Fort Worth, Texas. Before the war, he'd been a lawyer. Now, he commanded this camp and carried responsibilities that weighed heavier than any legal brief ever had. He had 2 children, Thomas, 15, Margaret, 12. He'd left them with his wife, Rebecca, when he shipped out to the Pacific in 1942, fought at Guadalcanal, saw enough death to last multiple lifetimes, came home briefly in late 1944, then got reassigned here, to Oklahoma, to manage German prisoners of war, including, as of this morning, 37 boys between 14 and 17 years old. When he'd received the orders, he'd called Rebecca. "They're sending me children," he'd said. "Then treat them like someone's children," she'd replied. "Like you'd want someone to treat Tommy if he was captured." The logic was irrefutable. The execution was harder than she'd made it sound. Harding addressed them now through Corporal James Lindgren, who'd grown up in Milwaukee in a German-speaking community and served as translator. "You are prisoners of war under Geneva Convention protection," Harding said. Lindgren translated, his accent carrying both English and German in a linguistic bridge between enemies. "You will be treated fairly but firmly. You will attend school, you will perform light work duties, you will receive adequate food and medical care." Harding paused. What he said next mattered. He'd thought about this carefully. The war is essentially over. Germany is defeated. I know you don't want to hear that. I know it contradicts everything you've been told. But it's the truth. Your job now is not to fight. Your job is to survive, to maintain your health, to prepare for eventual repatriation to whatever Germany becomes after reconstruction. The words landed like physical blows. Germany is defeated. None of the boys had fully accepted that reality, despite the evidence. Surrender had been individual act, their units collapsing rather than national catastrophe. But hearing it stated plainly by an American officer made it undeniable. The regime they'd been told was invincible had lost. The victory they'd been promised was myth. Everything they'd sacrificed, childhood, innocence, normalcy, had been for nothing. Eric felt anger flash hot in his chest, not at the Americans, surprisingly, but at the regime that had lied to them, that had sent children to war, that had promised victory while planning nothing but prolonged dying. He looked around the barracks at other boys, showing similar emotional cascades, and wondered how many felt the same fury at being betrayed by their own leadership more completely than they'd been defeated by enemies. One boy didn't sit quietly. Werner Steiner, 17 years old, from Berlin. He'd been in Hitler Youth organizations since age 10, absorbing ideology so completely it formed his identity. American mercy threatened everything he'd built his self-conception around. Werner stood abruptly. His voice carried across the barracks in sharp German. "Lies! This is propaganda! Germany will win! The Führer has secret weapons. Victory is certain. You're trying to break our will with false kindness." Every American guard tensed. Hands moved toward weapons. This could escalate quickly. A room full of armed soldiers and one shouting teenage fanatic. The mathematics of violence were simple and brutal. Captain Harding raised one hand, a small gesture. The guards relaxed slightly. Still alert, but no longer on the edge of action. Harding looked at Werner, really looked. Saw a 17-year-old boy who'd had his entire worldview weaponized against him, who'd been taught that surrender was betrayal and mercy was manipulation, who was terrified and covering it with ideology because ideology was all he had left. "Sit down, son," Harding said. His voice was calm, not threatening, not mocking, just calm. Lindgren translated. Werner stood rigid, defiant. "Time will show you the truth," Harding continued. "But right now, you're exhausted and scared, and in a foreign country, surrounded by people you've been taught to fear. So, sit down, eat, rest. We'll talk more tomorrow." It wasn't an order barked by a superior. It was advice offered by someone older. Werner's certainty wavered. He looked around at other boys, seeking support, found only exhaustion and relief that someone else was causing the scene instead of them. Slowly, Werner sat. Harding nodded, continued with the orientation as if the interruption had been minor, which, in a sense, it was. Just a boy shouting because the world had stopped making sense, and shouting was easier than accepting that everything was broken. That evening, lying on his bunk in American prison barracks in Oklahoma, Eric tried to process the day. He'd expected beatings and received chocolate. He'd expected starvation and received beef stew. He'd expected torture and received hot showers and medical care. Every expectation based on propaganda had been wrong. The Americans weren't savages. They were professional soldiers following rules, showing mercy despite having every reason for vengeance. Their country hadn't been invaded. Their cities hadn't been bombed by German planes. Yet they treated enemy children with more care than Germany's own regime had shown its sons. Stefan climbed into the bunk above Eric and whispered in the darkness. "Do you think they're really like this, the Americans, or did we just get lucky with these particular guards?" Eric considered before responding. He pulled the chocolate wrapper from his pocket, unfolded it carefully in the dark, ran his fingers over the creased paper. "I think maybe we've been lied to about everything," he said quietly. "Maybe American cruelty was propaganda. Maybe our invincibility was propaganda. Maybe all of it was lies, and we're only now seeing truth." In a nearby bunk, Felix was crying quietly. Not from fear or pain, but from emotional overload. From relief and grief and confusion, all mixed together into something impossible to untangle. He was 14 years old, 3,000 miles from home, a prisoner of war in a country he'd been taught to hate. And the hardest part wasn't captivity. The hardest part was realizing that enemies were treating him better than his own regime had. That strangers were showing more care than leaders who'd claimed to be protecting him. That everything he'd believed about good and evil and us and them had been inverted so completely he didn't know which way was up anymore. Eric folded the chocolate wrapper and put it back in his pocket. Tomorrow, they'd said, there would be school. Actual school. English lessons and mathematics and things that had nothing to do with war or death or survival. Like someone believed they had futures worth preparing for. He closed his eyes. The bunk was more comfortable than anywhere he'd slept in months. The barracks were warm. His stomach was full. He was safe. For the first time since conscription, Eric Hoffman fell asleep without fear. Outside, spring rain fell on Oklahoma soil. Inside, 37 German boys slept in enemy captivity and dreamed of home. Some dreams were nightmares of what they'd left behind. Some were impossible fantasies of what might still exist when they returned. But some, like Eric's, were quiet and almost peaceful. Dreams where chocolate tasted sweet and strangers showed kindness and maybe, just maybe, the world could be good again. The propaganda had promised bullets. America had given them chocolate instead. That was the first crack in the wall, the first moment when certainty gave way to doubt, when hate began losing its grip to something more complicated, more human. It was March 17th, 1945. The war had 49 days left to run. But for 37 boys in Oklahoma, the real war, the one fought inside themselves between what they'd been taught and what they were experiencing, had just begun. And Captain Nathaniel Harding, lying awake in his own quarters, stared at the ceiling and thought about his son Thomas back in Fort Worth. 15 years old. Same age as that boy Eric. Same frightened eyes trying to look brave. Same thin frame that should be playing baseball instead of wearing uniforms. What if Tommy had been captured? What if enemy soldiers held his son and had to decide how to treat him? Harding had made his decision. He would treat these boys exactly how he prayed someone would treat Thomas. With firmness, yes, with security and structure and rules, but also with recognition that they were children, someone's sons, someone's brothers, human beings who deserved mercy, even though their country hadn't shown mercy to others. It was the right thing to do. He was certain of that. Whether it would make any difference in the larger catastrophe of war, he didn't know. Probably not. 37 boys saved from cruelty wouldn't change the death toll, or rebuild the destroyed cities, or bring back the millions already lost. But it might change 37 lives, might plant seeds of understanding that could grow into something better than hatred, might demonstrate that victory didn't require brutality, that power could coexist with compassion. That would have to be enough. Captain Harding finally slept. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Teaching boys who'd been enemies, managing guards who questioned why they were coddling the opposition, navigating regulations that hadn't contemplated juvenile prisoners in significant numbers. But tonight, 37 boys slept safely in his camp. Federal, warm, protected. That was something. Maybe not much in the grand scheme of war and history and geopolitics, but it was something. And sometimes something was all you could offer. Sometimes the choice was between small mercy or large cruelty. And you picked mercy, even knowing it wouldn't change the world. You picked mercy because the alternative was becoming what you were fighting against. The rain continued falling. The night passed. Morning would come, and with it, the long process of transformation would continue, from enemies to something else. Not quite friends, not yet, but no longer simply soldiers and prisoners. Something more complicated, more human. Something that began with a chocolate bar on a train platform and a choice to see children instead of enemies. Morning came with Oklahoma sunrise, red and gold spreading across flat horizon like paint across canvas. The boys woke to bugles and routines that felt almost normal, almost like life before war had made everything about survival instead of living. Breakfast was oatmeal with brown sugar, toast with real butter, coffee for those who wanted it. The Americans didn't stint on portions, didn't make them beg or grovel or prove worthiness, just served food like feeding people was the obvious thing to do. Eric ate slowly. His stomach was adjusting to regular meals. The constant gnawing hunger that had been his companion for months was fading, being replaced by something stranger, the possibility of satiation, of having enough. At 8 o'clock they were escorted to what had been a storage building. Now it was a classroom. Desks arranged in rows, chalkboard at the front. Maps on the walls showing a world the boys didn't fully recognize. Germany divided into colored zones, territories marked with names of occupying powers, a country that no longer existed as they'd known it. Mrs. Eleanor Ashford stood at the front of the classroom. She was 54 years old, silver hair pulled back, sensible dress, reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She looked like someone's grandmother, which she was. But she was also a teacher who'd volunteered for this unusual assignment. Her son David was 16, fighting in the Pacific. She hadn't heard from him in 6 weeks, didn't know if he was alive or dead. So when Captain Harding asked for volunteers to teach German prisoners, she'd raised her hand, partly from patriotism, partly from recognition that these were children despite being enemies. Partly because if David was captured somewhere, she prayed someone would teach him instead of leaving him to rot in ignorance and despair. She looked at the 37 faces staring back at her, wary, uncertain, some hostile, all exhausted in ways that went deeper than missed sleep. "Good morning," she said clearly, gestured for them to repeat. The boys mumbled the phrase with German accents thick enough to make comprehension difficult. The words came out mangled. Morning became something closer to Morgan. Good became gut. Mrs. Ashford smiled patiently. "Good morning. Let's try again." Slowly, haltingly they practiced, a greeting that had nothing to do with warfare or captivity, just polite social exchange between humans who happened to speak different languages. The mundane normalcy of it was almost shocking after months of nothing being normal at all. Eric found himself engaged despite initial resistance. Learning felt like something from before, from when life included school and homework and concerns about grades rather than survival. He'd been a decent student before conscription, had liked mathematics and geography, had imagined maybe becoming an engineer or architect someday. Those dreams had seemed impossible after being drafted, after seeing combat, after accepting that his future would be whatever the regime assigned, or more likely, no future at all. But sitting in this classroom practicing English pronunciation, he felt something almost like hope, that maybe there was life beyond war, beyond captivity, beyond the ashes of everything he'd known. Stefan struggled more. His height made him look older. His experiences made him feel ancient. Yet the education level was appropriate for his actual age rather than his apparent maturity. He didn't want to be here, didn't want to learn the enemy's language, didn't want to adapt to captivity's routines. But resistance was exhausting. Eventually he found himself participating despite intentions not to, found himself raising his hand to answer questions, found himself caring about getting pronunciations correct, even though he told himself he wouldn't care about anything American. Felix thrived. He was youngest, most adaptable, least hardened by propaganda and combat. He absorbed English vocabulary with speed that surprised Mrs. Ashford. She made notes in her reports about how some young minds seemed almost grateful for normal intellectual stimulation after trauma and deprivation. Felix liked having correct answers, liked the structure of grammar rules, liked that this classroom felt safe in ways nothing had felt safe for years. He could focus on learning irregular verbs instead of wondering if he'd survive the day. That trade felt like luxury beyond measure. Werner sat in the back, arms crossed, expression dark. He participated minimally, spoke only when directly called upon, treated the whole exercise like collaboration with the enemy, which, in a sense, it was. Mrs. Ashford didn't force the issue, just included him in lessons without singling him out, gave him time. She'd taught long enough to recognize that some students needed space before they could accept help. Afternoons brought work assignments. Captain Harding had determined that some productivity was necessary both for camp operations and for prisoner morale. But children shouldn't perform hard labor. So the boys were assigned to gardening, kitchen assistance, maintenance tasks that taught skills while avoiding exploitation. Eric was assigned to the camp garden. Vegetables were grown there to supplement food supplies. He worked alongside Private Augustus Mercer, Iowa farmer before the war, quiet man who treated the garden with serious respect. Mercer demonstrated proper planting techniques, explained crop rotation principles, showed genuine pride in producing good vegetables. The interaction was surreal. Enemy soldier teaching prisoner agricultural skills as if they were colleagues rather than captor and captive. Mercer spoke minimal German, Eric spoke minimal English, but they communicated through gestures and shared work, hands in soil, seeds planted in rows, water distributed with care. Gradually, Eric learned more than gardening, learned that Americans weren't so different from Germans, that soldiers on both sides were mostly ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances, that enemy status was constructed and could be deconstructed through simple acts of cooperation. The tomato plants were already sprouting, early spring growth in Oklahoma soil. Mercer showed Eric how to stake them properly, how to pinch off suckers to encourage fruit production. Technical knowledge transferred from Iowa farm to German prisoner who might someday use these skills to grow food in whatever rubble Dresden had become. One afternoon, Captain Harding walked through the garden. Eric saw him coming and tensed. Officers meant inspections, meant opportunities for punishment. Old instincts died hard. Harding stopped at the tomato rows, examined Eric's work, nodded approval to Mercer, then did something unexpected. He pulled out his wallet, extracted a photograph, held it where Eric could see. The photo showed a teenage boy, 15, maybe 16, wearing some kind of uniform Eric didn't recognize. Scout uniform, though Eric didn't know that. The boy was smiling, healthy, well-fed, everything Eric hadn't been in years. "My son," Harding said. The English was incomprehensible, but the gesture was clear. Thomas, 15 years old. Eric stared at the photograph. Understanding crashed over him like cold water. The American captain had a son, same age as Eric. That's why he'd looked at the arriving prisoners with such intensity. That's why he'd insisted on decent treatment. He saw his own child in their faces. "Like you," Harding continued, even though Eric couldn't understand the words. The meaning came through anyway, carried by tone and context and the way Harding's thumb traced his son's image in the photograph. Eric felt something crack inside his chest. Some wall he'd built to protect himself from feeling too much, from hoping too much, from trusting enemies who might still prove propaganda right. "War made you a soldier," Harding said quietly. Corporal Lindgren had appeared to translate, materializing like he'd sensed something important happening. "But you're still just a boy, someone's son." The translation hit Eric harder than any bullet could have. Someone's son. Not enemy combatant, not prisoner number, not faceless German to be processed and managed. Someone's son. His vision blurred, tears came before he could stop them. He tried to wipe them away, failed. Just stood there in an Oklahoma garden crying, while an American captain looked at him with the same expression Eric's father might have worn if he'd lived to see what his youngest son had become. Harding stepped forward, put his hand on Eric's shoulder, a paternal gesture, firm but gentle, the kind of touch that said, "You're not alone and I see you and you matter." "You're safe here," Harding said. "I promise." Eric understood maybe one word in three, but he understood everything that mattered. This man would protect him, not because of orders or Geneva Conventions or political calculation, but because when he looked at Eric, he saw Thomas, saw his own son, and couldn't hate what looked like his child. "Thank you, sir," Eric managed in broken English, the words Mrs. Ashford had taught that morning. "Thank you." Harding nodded, squeezed Eric's shoulder once more, then walked on, continuing his inspection, leaving Eric standing among tomato plants with tears on his face and something like hope growing where fear had been. Stefan's assignment was the kitchen. He worked under Sergeant Theodore Calloway. The mess hall fed 600 people daily, prisoners and staff. The logistics were staggering. The quantities of food exceeded anything Stefan had imagined. Calloway ran the kitchen with professional precision. He'd learned cooking from his grandmother in Georgia, learned that food was love made tangible, that feeding people well was its own form of care. He taught Stefan proper knife techniques, how to dice onions without crying, how to break down vegetables efficiently, how to season by taste rather than measurement. Practical skills transferred with the same seriousness another sergeant might teach weapons maintenance. One afternoon, Stefan gathered courage to ask a question. Lindgren was nearby, could translate. "Sergeant Calloway, sir, why do you give us so much food?" Calloway stopped chopping, set down his knife, looked at Stefan with an expression that held depths the boy couldn't quite read. "My grandmother raised me," Calloway said, waited for Lindgren to translate. "We were poor, Georgia poor, which is about as poor as it gets. But Grandma always said something I never forgot." He picked up the knife again, resumed chopping, spoke while working. She said, "Teddy, you feed people first. Ask questions later. Hate grows in empty bellies. Love grows with full ones. You want to make peace with someone, you start by making sure they ain't hungry." The words translated into German carried weight beyond their simple grammar. Stefan looked around the kitchen, at the industrial-sized pots, the massive bags of flour and sugar, the walk-in refrigerators containing more meat than he'd seen in years. He thought about Hamburg, about his sister Anna, 12 years old and skeletal, about his mother rationing food so the children could eat, about the gnawing hunger that had been constant companion since 1943. Guilt and relief mixed into something complicated. He was eating well while his family starved. He was safe while they endured whatever Hamburg had become under British occupation. He was learning English and cooking skills while they struggled through rubble and desperation. "You got good hands, Stefan," Calloway said, watching the boy's face journey through complicated emotions. "You work clean, work smart. After this war ends, after you go home, you could be a cook. Good trade, honourable trade, always need cooks." The suggestion that Stefan had a future beyond this moment was revolutionary. That skills learned in captivity might have value in whatever came after. That there would be an after at all. "Feed people," Calloway continued. "Make them happy with good food. That's how you build peace, one meal at a time." Stefan nodded, couldn't speak, just nodded and returned to chopping vegetables with hands that were learning both cooking and something deeper. Learning that food could be bridge between enemies, that sharing meals created bonds stronger than ideology could break. Felix worked in the camp library, small room with donated books, magazines, newspapers. Prisoners could access it during free time. His job was organizing, cataloging, keeping the space tidy. The American librarian was Mrs. Davis, Sergeant Brennan's wife. She'd volunteered because she believed literacy was fundamental human right that didn't disappear during wartime. She showed Felix the organizational system, taught him library science basics, treated him like a young assistant rather than enemy prisoner. The library had German books, classics mostly, carefully vetted to exclude propaganda, but include literature that represented German cultural achievement without regime ideology. Felix found Goethe's Faust, Thomas Mann's Buddenbrooks, Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha. Writers he'd heard about, but never read, because the regime had been suspicious of literature that wasn't explicitly ideological. He spent spare moments reading, discovering his own culture through books in enemy captivity, finding identity that had nothing to do with the regime or the war or the defeat, just German words expressing human experiences that transcended politics. Hesse's Siddhartha particularly struck him, the journey toward enlightenment, the rejection of dogma in favor of personal experience. The recognition that truth couldn't be taught, only discovered. Felix read passages over and over, underlining sentences that felt like someone reaching across time to speak directly to his confusion. Mrs. Davis noticed his engagement, brought him tea one afternoon, sat across the small table. "You like Hesse?" she asked. Lindgren translated during his library visits. Felix nodded. "He writes about finding truth, about not believing what you're told just because someone in authority says it." Mrs. Davis smiled, sad but understanding. "That's a hard lesson to learn, especially when the lies come from people you're supposed to trust." "I trusted them," Felix said quietly. "The teachers, the youth leaders. They said America was evil, that we were fighting for civilization, that victory was certain." He looked up. "They lied about everything." "Yes," Mrs. Davis agreed, "they did. And now you get to decide what you believe, not because someone tells you, but because you've experienced it yourself. That's what growing up means, learning to trust your own judgment." Felix considered this. At 14, he'd never been encouraged to trust his own judgment, just to obey, to believe, to follow. Making his own decisions felt dangerous and liberating simultaneously. "Books help," Mrs. Davis said. "They show you how other people thought through difficult questions, give you tools for figuring things out yourself." She paused. "My son David loved books, took a whole footlocker full when he shipped out to the Pacific." Felix heard the past tense, the love that hadn't stopped but existed now in different grammatical form. "Is he—" "I don't know," Mrs. Davis said. "Haven't heard in weeks, so I come here, help boys like you, and hope that wherever David is, if he needs help, someone is being kind." The connection was obvious. She helped enemy children because somewhere her own child might need help from enemies who could choose mercy over vengeance. The mathematics of hope in wartime. Felix understood something then about why the Americans treated them well. Not from weakness or naivety, but from recognition that cruelty multiplied, while mercy might, just might, create ripples that reach back to protect their own. Werner remained isolated. He worked alone on maintenance tasks, refused to integrate, spent evenings in separate quarters, writing manifestos about Nazi ideology and German superiority, and how American kindness was psychological warfare designed to break their will. His intensity frightened some younger boys, reminded them of the regime's hardness, represented everything they were gradually learning to question. But Werner couldn't question, wouldn't question. His entire identity was built on ideology. Remove that foundation, and he had nothing left. Captain Harding tried patience first, allowed Werner his resistance, provided space for adjustment, hoped time would soften certainties. But Werner's influence was spreading, creating faction among prisoners between those adapting and those clinging to ideology. Finally, Harding intervened. Not with punishment, with isolation. Werner was moved to separate housing, not as cruelty, as recognition that his presence was preventing others from healing. The separation broke something in Werner. Alone, without audience for his ideology, without peers to reinforce propaganda certainties, he confronted reality he'd been avoiding. Day one, he remained defiant, wrote more manifestos, shouted slogans at walls. Day two, doubt crept in. Why hadn't the Americans beaten him for his defiance? Why did they continue feeding him well despite his hostility? Why did Captain Harding look at him with something like pity rather than hatred? Day three, the wall collapsed. Harding visited that afternoon, found Werner sitting on his bunk staring at nothing. The manifestos were torn up, scattered across the floor like snow. Werner looked up when Harding entered. His eyes were red, face blotchy from crying. He looked young, impossibly young. Not a fanatic, but a 17-year-old boy whose entire worldview had shattered. "They lied," Werner said in German. Lindgren translated from the doorway. "About everything. The Americans. You're not brutal. You're not weak. You're just decent. And if they lied about you, then—" He couldn't finish. The implications were too vast. If they'd lied about Americans, they'd lied about Jews, about Slavs, about everyone they'd labeled subhuman, about the war's purpose, about Germany's destiny, about everything that made sense of the sacrifices and suffering and death. Yes, Harding said quietly. They lied. To you. To all of Germany. And now you have a choice. Werner looked up, waiting. You can stay angry at the lies, at the people who lied, at yourself for believing. That anger will poison everything. Harding paused. Or you can start healing. Accept that you were manipulated, that you're not responsible for being lied to, that your life isn't over at 17, that you can still become someone good. I wasted everything, Werner whispered. Believed in monsters, followed evil, hurt people who didn't deserve it. You were a child, Harding said. They took children and weaponized them. That's not your fault. What matters now is what you choose next. Werner sat silently, processing. The hardest thing wasn't accepting that he'd be lied to. The hardest thing was accepting that he could be forgiven, that transformation was possible, that the future didn't have to be defined by the past. Can I apologize? He finally asked. To the other boys? To Eric and Stefan and Felix? To everyone? Yes, Harding said. You can apologize, and they might forgive you, or they might not, but you can try. That evening, Werner was returned to general population. He stood in front of the assembled boys during dinner, looked at faces he'd harangued and threatened, and tried to keep trapped in ideology because he couldn't escape alone. I was wrong, he said in German. Simple words, devastating honesty. About everything. The Americans aren't monsters. We weren't fighting for civilization. The ideology I believed was poison. His voice broke. I'm sorry. For trying to keep you from seeing truth. For being angry at your adaptation when I should have been grateful you survived. Eric stood first, walked to Werner, extended his hand. We were all lied to. You just believed longer. That's not unforgivable. Stefan and Felix followed, others after them. Not everyone forgave immediately. Some remained wary. But most recognized that Werner had been victim too, just took him longer to escape the cage. Werner joined them for meals after that, participated in classes, worked in the kitchen with Stefan, remained quieter than before. The brightness was gone from his eyes, replaced by sadness that came from learning you'd been betrayed by those who claimed to protect you. But the rage was gone too, and the certainty that had made him dangerous to himself and others. He was healing, slowly, painfully, but healing. November brought cold and approaching holidays. Mrs. Ashford suggested Thanksgiving education, teaching the boys about American traditions, the history of pilgrims and harvest and gratitude. It was cultural exchange, wrapped in language lessons, wrapped in the simple fact that humans across cultures had always gathered to celebrate survival and abundance. The boys practiced the word Thanksgiving until they could pronounce it clearly, learned about turkeys and cranberries and pumpkin pie, concepts so foreign they might as well have been describing life on Mars. But interesting, novel, different from the grim sameness of wartime scarcity. Captain Harding made an announcement, November 21st, evening formation. Tomorrow is Thanksgiving, he said, Lindgren translating. It's an American holiday, a day we give thanks for what we have, for harvest, for family, for survival, for peace. He paused, looked at the assembled boys, saw the hope and fear and confusion in their faces. You'll join us tomorrow for Thanksgiving dinner, not as prisoners, as guests, because whatever else is true, you survived, and survival deserves gratitude. The boys didn't fully understand. How could they be guests when they were prisoners? How could they celebrate when their country had lost? How could they give thanks when everything was broken? But Harding's expression said this mattered, said he meant it, said tomorrow would be different from any day they'd experienced since conscription had stolen their childhoods and war had stolen everything else. Tomorrow would be Thanksgiving. And for 37 boys who'd expected bullets and gotten chocolate, who'd expected cruelty and gotten mercy, who'd expected to die as enemies, and instead were learning to live as something more complicated than anyone's propaganda had allowed, tomorrow represented something unprecedented. The possibility that even in captivity, even in defeat, even in the wreckage of everything they'd believed, there could still be moments worth celebrating, still abundance worth sharing, still humanity worth acknowledging, across every line war had drawn. Tomorrow would tell them if that possibility was real, or just another dream that would dissolve in morning light like so many dreams before it. But tonight, they let themselves hope. Just a little. Just enough. Tomorrow was Thanksgiving, and maybe, just maybe, they had something to be thankful for after all. November 22nd, 1945, Thanksgiving Day. The smell started at 11 in the morning, drifted across the campyard like an invisible tide, roasting turkey, sage and thyme, hot butter and baking bread, scents that bypassed rational thought and went straight to memory, to childhood, to before. The boys stopped mid-task, noses lifted, inhaling something they'd almost forgotten existed, the smell of abundance, of celebration, of food prepared not just for sustenance, but for joy. Stefan's knees actually weakened. He grabbed the counter to steady himself. 3 years since he'd smelled real meat cooking. 3 years of ersatz everything, of turnips and potatoes and bread stretched with sawdust, of hunger so constant it became background noise you stopped noticing until its absence shocked you awake. Felix whimpered. Actual sound of longing that embarrassed him immediately, but nobody mocked. They all felt it, the visceral response to plenty after years of scarcity. By noon, the mess hall had been transformed. Long tables arranged with actual tablecloths, white cotton that had been pressed and starched, place settings with real plates, not the tin mess kits, glasses for cider, silverware that matched. Someone had put autumn leaves in mason jars as centerpieces, made it look like a holiday, like celebration rather than captivity. The boys filed in at 1 o'clock, uncertain steps, still expecting the trap, the cruelty, the moment when American kindness revealed itself as elaborate psychological torture. Because this couldn't be real, couldn't be sincere. Enemy nations didn't feed each other's children at holiday tables with decorations and care. Except apparently they did. Captain Harding stood at the head table, waited until everyone was seated. Americans and Germans mixed together rather than segregated. Intentional choice, symbolic breaking of barriers. He raised his glass. Cider, golden in afternoon light streaming through windows. "Today we give thanks," Harding said, Lindgren translating sentence by sentence. "In America, this is our tradition. We gather, we eat together, we acknowledge what we're grateful for, despite hardship." He paused, looked at the German boys, saw their fear and hope and hunger and confusion. "I'm thankful this war is ending, thankful these boys survived when so many didn't, thankful I could see them not as enemies, but as what they truly are, someone's children." His voice caught, steadied, continued. "I have a son, Thomas, 15 years old, back in Texas with my wife Rebecca. Every time I look at you boys, I see him. And I pray that if he was ever scared and alone in enemy hands, someone would show him mercy." Harding's eyes were wet. He didn't hide it, didn't apologize for emotion. "Today we're not captors and captives, we're just people, sharing a meal, sharing gratitude for survival, for the possibility of peace, for the chance to build something better than what war destroyed." He sat, nodded to Sergeant Calloway. The kitchen doors opened. What emerged was abundance made visible, made tangible, made real in ways that defied every expectation propaganda had built. 25-pound turkeys, 4 of them, golden brown skin crackling and glistening, steam rising in visible ribbons, carried on platters by American soldiers who smiled at the boys' expressions. Mashed potatoes piled high, butter melting into yellow rivers down white mountains. Real butter, real cream, salt and pepper and richness. Sweet potatoes glazed with brown sugar and pecans. Amber and orange catching light like stained glass. Green bean casserole bubbling. Cranberry sauce ruby red and glistening. Stuffing fragrant with sage and onions and celery. Gravy in boats that steamed and smelled of turkey drippings and flour and love. Baskets of rolls, fresh baked, still warm, with butter pats shaped like stars. And pies. 3 pumpkin pies, cinnamon dusted, whipped cream dolloped in peaks. The boys stared, mouths open, eyes wide, brains unable to process the contrast between this and every meal they'd eaten since 1942. Eric felt tears start, couldn't stop them, didn't try, just sat there as American soldiers served him turkey and potatoes and vegetables. As his plate filled with more food than he'd seen in a single meal in 3 years. As the impossible became real and propaganda shattered completely under the weight of roasted poultry and genuine kindness. Private Mercer served Eric's table, spooned mashed potatoes onto the plate, looked at Eric's tears,
said quietly, "It's okay, son. Eat. You're safe here."
Eric picked up his fork, hands shaking, cut a piece of turkey breast, still steaming, still hot from the oven, lifted it to his mouth. The taste exploded across his tongue, rich, fatty, seasoned with herbs he'd forgotten existed. Flavor so intense after years of bland that it felt almost painful, almost too much, but also exactly what his body and soul needed. He chewed, swallowed, took another bite. Mashed potatoes this time, butter and cream and salt, texture like clouds, like comfort made edible. Third bite, sweet potato, brown sugar and pecans, sweetness and richness and complexity. The tears fell into his food, mixed with gravy. He couldn't stop eating and couldn't stop crying, the 2 actions simultaneous and equally involuntary. Stefan had the same reaction, eating and crying, remembering Anna's hollow cheeks, her ribs showing through thin dress, her voice asking if there would be food tomorrow, him lying and saying yes because what else could he say? Felix was overwhelmed, 14 years old, never experienced anything like this abundance, not before the war, certainly not during. He ate slowly, carefully, like the food might disappear if he moved too fast. Werner sat quietly, tears on his face too, but his were different. Grief mixed with rage directed inward. How many people had he insulted for accepting American kindness? How much time had he wasted believing lies? Around the room, American soldiers ate too. Some watched the boys with satisfaction, with recognition that this mattered, that feeding starving children well was both moral necessity and strategic wisdom. Some soldiers cried too, thinking about their own children, about boys overseas who might be hungry and scared. After the main course, Harding stood again. In America, at Thanksgiving, we share what we're thankful for. Each person says something they're grateful for, despite hardship. He looked at the German boys. You don't have to participate, but if you want to, we'd like to hear. Silence, long and uncertain. Then Eric stood, slowly, shakily. The room quieted. He spoke in broken English, words Mrs. Ashford had taught, grammar imperfect but meaning crystal clear. Thank you, Captain Harding, sir. You see us human, not monster, not enemy. Human. His voice cracked. You like father, when we have no father. Thank you. He sat abruptly, couldn't continue. The emotion was too much. Harding stood, walked to Eric's table, put his hand on the boy's shoulder. Same paternal gesture as in the garden. Same recognition of shared humanity across manufactured divisions. You're welcome, son, Harding said, voice rough with feeling. You're welcome. The room erupted, not with applause, with tears, Americans and Germans crying together, barriers dissolving, enemies becoming something else, something more human than war allowed. Stefan stood next. I thankful for Sergeant Calloway. He teach me food make peace. I remember. After war, I feed people. Felix stood. I thankful for books, for Mrs. Davis, for Mrs. Ashford, for finding truth in words. Werner stood last, hardest. I thankful you patient with me. When I deserve nothing, you wait, you show truth. Thank you. The meal continued. Pie was served, pumpkin with whipped cream, sweet and spiced and rich. The boys ate slowly, savoring, knowing this moment was temporary, but wanting it to last forever. Winter passed into spring. The routine continued. School in mornings, work in afternoons. English improved. Skills developed. The war in Europe ended May 8th. News reached camp by radio. Germany surrendered. Unconditional, total, final. The boys received the news with mixed emotions. Relief that dying had stopped. Grief for what had been lost. Fear for what came next. Letters trickled in through Red Cross channels. Eric's mother confirmed alive.
Living in basement of bombed building, minimal food, waiting for her son.
Stefan received no letters from Hamburg. The silence was devastating. Felix heard from both parents, alive in Munich, under American occupation, struggling but surviving. Werner received no letters. His parents remained missing, presumed dead in Berlin's final battle. April 12th, 1946. Captain Harding called assembly. "You'll begin returning to Germany in May," he said, Lindgren translating. "You'll go home." Home. The word felt strange, meant something different now than it had 14 months ago. Over the following weeks, Harding met with each boy individually. Eric's meeting came first, Harding's office, afternoon light through windows. "Eric," Harding said, handed him an envelope. Inside was an official letter of recommendation, also $10 in American currency, money from Harding's own pocket. "You'll rebuild Dresden. I know you will. You're strong. You're smart.
And now you know that enemies can become friends, that mercy matters more than vengeance."
Eric took the envelope, throat tight. "Thank you, sir, for everything, for seeing me." "Go home, son," Harding said, voice breaking. "Build something good. Teach your children about mercy. Make sure Germany never goes down this path again." "I will, sir. I promise." They shook hands. Then Harding pulled Eric into an embrace. Father and son separated by nationality and circumstance, but connected by something deeper. Stefan met with Calloway, received handwritten recipe cards, grandmother's recipes from Georgia, written carefully in English with German translations. "Feed people, Stefan," Calloway said. "Make them happy with good food. That's how you build peace, one meal at a time." Calloway gave him more. A chef's knife, well used, balanced, valuable. "My knife. Take it. Use it. Remember that food heals what war destroys." Felix met with Mrs. Ashford.
She gave him her son David's copy of Siddhartha.
Worn, pages dog-eared, notes in margins. Inside the cover, she'd written, "To Felix, may you find peace in knowledge, not propaganda. May you teach others what you learned here. With love, Eleanor Ashford." "I become teacher, like you. I teach truth. I tell them about Oklahoma, about Americans who chose kindness." Werner met with Harding last. Harding had arranged placement in a Munich orphanage run by Catholic sisters, had provided contact information, had written ahead to ensure Werner would be accepted. "You have your whole life ahead," Harding said. "Build things, churches, homes, futures, not weapons." He gave Werner $20. Tools, a carpentry manual. "You were lost. We found you. Now go find yourself." Werner couldn't speak, just nodded, accepted the gifts, accepted the second chance. May 15th, 1946. Departure day. The same train platform where they'd arrived 14 months ago. Full circle.
Sergeant Brennan appeared with a box. Inside were 37 Hershey bars, one for each boy.
"For the journey home," Brennan said. "Remember where it started." The boys lined up to board. Eric stopped at the train car steps, turned back, saw Captain Harding standing on the platform. Eric ran back, threw his arms around Harding, hugged him like he'd hugged his father once upon a time before Stalingrad. "You saved my life, Captain. Not with bullets, with seeing me as human. I never forget." Harding held him tight. "Go build a good Germany, Eric. Make us proud." Stefan hugged Calloway. Felix hugged Mrs. Ashford. Werner shook Harding's hand with firm grip and eye contact. The train whistle blew. The boys climbed aboard, found seats by windows, faces pressed against glass. Eric pulled out his chocolate bar. unwrapped it carefully, saved the wrapper like he'd saved the first one, ate the chocolate slowly. The train pulled away. Oklahoma disappeared into distance. The boys were going home, to uncertainty, to rubble, to whatever future waited. But they were going with hope, with English, with skills, with the knowledge that enemies could become family. Eric pressed his face to the window, watched America fade, held the chocolate wrapper tight. The journey home had begun. Fade to black. 3 seconds of silence. Text appears, large, white letters on black screen. 50 years later. May 15th, 1996. Fort Worth, Texas. Spring morning. The international arrivals gate at the airport. Captain Nathaniel Harding is 84 years old now. Sits in wheelchair his son insists he needs. Thomas pushes. 66 now. Lawyer like his father. Successful practice. Good life. But Thomas knows his father's real legacy wasn't law. Was 4 German boys in Oklahoma. Was choosing mercy when vengeance would have been easier. The gate opens. Passengers stream out. Then 4 men appear. Silver-haired, aged but recognizable. Faces Harding has carried in memory for 50 years. Eric Hoffman, 66. Grey suit, carries small bag. Stefan Braun, 67. Prosperous, kind eyes. Felix Weber, 65. Retired teacher, gentle presence. Werner Steiner, 68. Quiet, carrying weight of redemption. They see Harding. Wheelchair doesn't matter. Age doesn't matter. 50 years collapse into nothing. Eric runs. 66 years old, and he runs like the boy who received chocolate. Drops to his knees beside the wheelchair. Grabs Harding's hands. "Captain," he says, crying. "Captain Harding, we came to say thank you." Harding pulls him up. Stands. Wheelchair forgotten. Embraces Eric like the son he hasn't seen in 50 years. Stefan and Felix and Werner join. Group embrace. 5 old men crying in airport terminal. Other travelers watching. Moved by something they recognize as important. As love transcending time and nationality. Eric pulls back, reaches into his bag, abstracts something wrapped in archival plastic. The chocolate wrapper. 51 years old. Brown paper faded but intact. Hershey logo still visible. "I kept this," Eric says, holding it like sacred text. "Every single day. To remember." Harding takes the wrapper, hands shaking, stares at it like message from his younger self. "You kept it. All these years." "How could I not? This is when my life began. When I stopped being enemy and became human again." Stefan opens his briefcase, pulls out framed document, recipe card, Callaway's handwriting. "I named my restaurants Harding's Table," Stefan says. "Hamburg, Berlin, Munich. 3 locations. This recipe on every menu. Every customer learns the story." Felix shows his book, Siddhartha, 51 Years of Wear. Mrs. Ashford's inscription still clear. "I taught for 40 years. First day every year, I told your story. 1,200 students heard about American mercy in Oklahoma." Werner pulls out photo album, opens to marked page. Churches, 14 of them. "Each has plaque," Werner says quietly. "Built by one who was taught to build, not destroy." People ask, I tell them, about the captain who refused to give up on me. They talk for hours. In Thomas's living room, Harding in his chair, 4 old men around him, wives and children and grandchildren filling the house. 16 people total who exist because mercy happened in Oklahoma in 1945. That evening, Thomas serves dinner. Special menu requested by Eric. Turkey, mashed potatoes, sweet potatoes, green beans, cranberry sauce, rolls, pies. Thanksgiving dinner. May 15th. Wrong month. Right meaning. Full circle. They eat together. Same tears. Different context. Gratitude deeper because time has proven what seemed temporary was actually eternal. "I need to say something," Eric says. Others nod. They'd rehearsed this. They stand together. 4 men who'd been enemies. who'd been shown mercy,
who'd become living proof that peace is built one choice at a time.
Captain Nathaniel Harding, Eric says, voice steady despite emotion. We came 5,000 miles to say thank you. Thank you for seeing us as children. Thank you for feeding us when we expected death. Thank you for teaching us that enemies can become family. Thank you for showing mercy when you could have shown hate. You saved our lives. You changed our lives. We became good men because you were a good man first. Harding tries to speak. Can't. Just cries. I just did what any father would want done for his son, Harding finally manages. Exactly, Eric says. You were our father when we had none, and we never forgot. They eat, they talk, they share photos of lives lived well. As evening fades, Harding pulls Eric aside. Private moment. I'm glad I lived to see this, Harding says. To see what you became. You made it worth it. You're my redemption, Eric. You're our salvation, Eric replies.
You showed us humanity survives. That's the lesson. That's what we pass forward.
They embrace one final time, old men holding each other up, past and present meeting, mercy given and mercy returned. Text on screen. Captain Nathaniel Harding died October 3, 2001, age 89. Eric, Stefan, Felix and Werner attended his funeral. Thomas Harding said, "Dad talked about you until his last day. You were his proudest achievement." Eric Hoffman died 2007, age 77. The chocolate wrapper was donated to the National World War II Museum, New Orleans. Stefan Braun's restaurants still operate today. Grandchildren run Harding's table in 3 German cities. Every menu tells the story. Felix Weber taught until 1995. 1,200 students heard the story directly. Many became teachers themselves. The lesson multiplies. Werner Steiner built 14 churches before his death in 1999. Each carries a plaque about building, not destroying, architecture as testimony. Final image.
Museum display.
Glass case. Chocolate wrapper carefully preserved. Placard reads, Hershey bar wrapper, March 17, 1945, Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma. 15-year-old Eric Hoffman expected execution. Instead, Sergeant Wallace Brennan gave him chocolate. This wrapper, preserved for 62 years, represents the moment propaganda shattered and hope began. From this single act of kindness, 4 enemy boys became 4 good men who built peace in post-war Germany. Mercy is stronger than hatred. Peace begins with seeing the child, not the uniform. Harding's voice, final words. I gave them chocolate because I saw my son's face. They gave me hope that the world could still be good. War destroys. But small acts of kindness build futures. That's what I learned from 4 boys who expected bullets and got chocolate instead. Fade to black. Final text. Dedicated to all who choose mercy over vengeance, and to all children who survive war and build peace. See the child, not the uniform. Captain Nathaniel Harding, 1945. End.